Welcome back to the Flow Performance Podcast. My name is Ricky Dan, founder of Flow Nutrition and your host. On today's episode, we chat with Surfing Australia's performance psychologist, Tom Greer-Smith. Tom has worked with athletes from state to national levels, whilst also with high-performing business leaders and executives in the corporate world. In particular, Tom's expertise is in worry and perfectionism experienced in performance settings. I first met Tom back in 2014. A lesser-known fact about Tom is that he is a weapon of a tennis player, and we actually both met as tennis coaches at the University of Queensland. I'm so grateful our paths have crossed again since he's now working at Surfing Australia, and I cannot express how valuable his knowledge and insights are. In this episode, we discuss the mental performance in competition approach within sports psychology. Tom explains exactly what the approach involves, how he implements it with some of Surfing Australia's athletes, whilst also some general tips and strategies to manage stressful situations to perform at your best. If you're enjoying the podcast episodes and want to support the brand, make sure you jump on our website and grab some Flow nutritional bars. Our Flow Energy Bar is the easiest and most effective way to fuel before and during exercise, while our recovery bars nail the basics for post-exercise recovery. Just for listening to this episode, you can get 10% off your total order with the code FLOWPOD at checkout. Now, every chat with Tom is full of absolute gems, so grab yourself a pen and paper, sit back, relax, and enjoy the chat with performance psychologist Tom Greer-Smith. Today, I'm out at the HPC, Surfing Australia, with Surfing Australia performance psychologist Tom Greer-Smith. Mate, it's always a pleasure.
Thanks, mate. Thanks for having me.
No worries at all. So, we're going to dive straight into today's mindset-related question, which is, what's the go with mental performance in competition, or MPC, as you guys call it? So, my understanding is here at Surfing Australia, you guys, I think it's your team, have developed this concept, particularly to sort of help surfers thrive in like unknown conditions and just like higher stakes sort of environments. So if we can just start with a general summary of like what the MPC is for those who haven't heard of it.
Yep. So it originally came from the AIS in a review after one of the recent Olympics, going, we've got these athletes that are highly skilled, have high abilities, but for whatever reason they didn't perform in competition. And so the mental performance in competition program is across a fair few of the Olympic sports. Surfing was one of the first to take it up, from a real need to create a skill-based education platform to provide surfers the ability of how the mental skills to perform in competition. So we've been going for about 18 months now, and part of it is a theory-based curriculum that we provide a few different skills in the mental performance space. And then I guess what we've done uniquely at surfing is that we really recognised a need to simulate some of the stresses and pressure in competition. Because it's very common for athletes to be like, well, I do these skills and behaviours really well in the training environment. When I'm free surfing, I surf amazing, right? And then they're like, but for whatever reason, I can't translate that to competition.
Big issue.
Big issue. I mean, firstly, they're almost two different sports. So firstly, there does need to be acknowledgement that the environment and the context in which you're trying to perform in are very, very different, right? In free surfing, you're out there for a couple of hours. There's no pressure. You can catch as many waves as other people. You can be creative and do that, right? But in competition, there's some constructs. And on top of that, you care. Right? And so you care about stuff, you care about the result. There's judgment, literally from the judges. There's judgment from the public. And so all these things combined creates a very different psychological experience for the athlete that we kind of assume just because they're really good at surfing, that they should be able to execute skills on demand when it matters most in front of a ton of people. And I'm going, let's not assume that, because that's not
That's
fair.
a big assumption.
It's a big assumption.
Yeah.
And a lot of athletes come to me and assuming, how come I can't do this? I'm like, who says you should? Were you ever taught how to do this? You know, and obviously everyone brings their own learned experience and their background. Some people do have a natural ability to really deal with situations, pressure, emotions a lot better than other people. Good for them, and that's great. But then the average person, you and I'm going to call us average, is we're going, how do I do this? And on top of that, there's an expectational pressure that because you can do a skill really well, that you should then be able to do it when it matters most to you. And so that actually creates it creates additional pressure, because you've got the external pressure from the context, right? It's like, hey, this is a big comp and whatever. But then you have internal pressure because you have your own expectations. So that's where the whole concept came from, essentially. And so there's a theory component to provide the skills. What are we going to do in these different situations? What are the psychological skills and tools to be able to navigate through these different adverse situations? And then there's the practical component that we've done and I've spent a lot of time creating and developing over the last 12 months is, how do we simulate, recreate stress and pressure that's subjectively experienced by the individual in a training environment? And that's a hot topic at the moment.
Yeah, well, there's what you've just said. There's so many parallels there with actually what I'm doing my PhD on in skill acquisition. So we're taking an ecological dynamics approach and a representative learning design to replicate training and make it look like competition. And a massive part of that is, in our terminology, it's an affective learning design where you add in the emotion. And, you know, the most simple way to do that, right, is just create a scenario. And I think even if you go down to fifths cricket training, you see people in the nets, batters go, oh, set your field, you've got to get 4 off the last over. And that automatically just, even though it's the exact same shot, it's the same task constraints, it changes the whole environment massively. And so that's something that I'm super passionate about, is how can you add in that, whether it's pressure, that's just one thing you can add in, right? But what other constraints can you manipulate to make it more representative of competition? And that's essentially what you're doing there, right?
Yeah, definitely. And it's subjective, right? It's a hot topic right now, pressure testing. And there's a lot of different teams, national teams around the world that are trying to do it, and there's not a whole lot of literature on it at the moment. Tristan Coulter at QUT is probably leading the space right now in doing some robust investigations on it. And then from that, there's been a lot of questions, not as many answers from it, because there just isn't the literature on it. But what we do know is that just because you make a situation physically demanding and really, really difficult for the individual doesn't necessarily mean their perception of the stress and pressure is going to be increased. I think that's one key thing that I've even experienced, that when we first started, we're like, let's just hammer these guys with the gnarliest physical task, and therefore they will feel pressure because it's so physically demanding. And that's what we started doing in the MPC program, is that it very much was these on-beach pressure situations where we had an on-beach component, and so they were running along the sand with Oz tags, and we were tagging them and making it difficult for them to get through to the next stage. And then they had a memory component, and they had to finish this this memory puzzle, because we know as stress hormones increase, working memory decreases, and so we're going to need an ability to think and regulate when we're out there surfing. And so we then go, okay, let's physically make it demanding, because if you get tagged, then you have to run an extra thing. So the physically taxed when they're running through, and then that makes it harder and harder the longer it goes for, the less ability they have to remember the puzzle, and they have to complete the puzzle in order to then go out and surf, right? And so the whole time is, depending on the surf, but 15, 20 minutes. So, and a few times they haven't finished the puzzle, so that gets even more frustrating, right? They were in the early days, but we saw that there was with the reflection of those athletes, that they got a little bit more used to it. And some goes, yeah, I felt a lot of stress and pressure. Others felt less. So it's an individualized response to stress and pressure, depending on their learned experiences, depending on what's important to them and what they care about, right? So that was key in designing pressure situations and stresses. And so you've got to make it somewhat bespoke to the individual, but you do have groups. And it's not just, so that's one, right? It's like, it's not just physically demanding, like what actually stresses these people out, because there could be some sort of task around embarrassment or these different things like that. I think the second thing is, like with the review from, I think it was the English cricket team, but they just had gnarly, like commando type stuff, real physically demanding stuff. And the review back from the players was said, well, yeah, we really are scared of the consequence, because a lot of pressure testing is like, let's put a consequence to this because there's a consequence in competition. But the problem was that they said, yeah, but coach, but there isn't just a consequence when I go out there and play. There's a potential reward. So it's not just that I'm scared of the punishment, I want the reward. So what we've then created is going, hey, how do we have a balance of consequences that both have punishment and reward, right? So we say, hey, bring $20 to come and play, and and then you can win money off your mates. And then I think the other then powerful motivator is what we call the forfeit rule. And so in professional surfing, obviously, if you don't make your heat, you don't progress, like most other sports. So what we've been doing of late, getting ready for pipe, is like when you do the pressure drill, if you lose or you come last in it, then you don't get to do the next one. You sit out for the rest of the session, right? So that's really interesting. And I think the final thing around that design of pressure testing is it needs to be as context specific as possible. So now we're doing more stuff less on the beach and more in the water. It's like, how do we create more pressure and stress in a context-specific stuff? Because at the end of the day, that's where they're going to be feeling the emotions. That's where they're going to need to be able to think clearly and make good decisions out there. So it's definitely evolved a lot. But that, in a nutshell, is the NPC program.
I love that. And it makes so much sense. And it's quite scary how just changing a few little constraints can change someone's performance so dramatically. And for those listening, you probably wouldn't be aware, Tom and I used to play tennis together back in the day, coach at the UQ Tennis Centre. And what you were just saying there reminded me of tennis, where like if we were just go and knock on the court with no points, I would just be flushing the ball, hitting it really well. But until we started playing points, because there's no, like, if the ball goes out by a foot, but you just keep playing on. Like, you find that flow state so easy. But as soon as you add that constraint of, like, there's consequence by if the ball goes out, you lose the point. There's strategy on how to actually play the point. It's a whole new dynamic, even though arguably it's the same skill, right? Like,
and the brain has been designed over time and evolution to detect threats, right? So the brain doesn't always differentiate between the threat within competition and the threat of survival, because historically, if you lose a competition in our evolutionary past, that's also a threat to your survival. So the same hormonal response is triggered in competition, right? So there's a desire to win, but there's also a desire not to lose, met by different emotions, met by different release of chemicals, right? So that's what's changing there, is now when we've put the constraints of competition in there, there's a desire to win, because, again, from an evolutionary past, there's big benefits from winning a competition, the ape versus the ape and whatnot, is that, you go up the social hierarchy. And now with social media, then there is huge benefits to winning a competition at any level, but particularly on the world tour. So you win that, you get this social hierarchy, which is met with all these wonderful emotions, right? But equally, there's a consequence. We go down the social hierarchy as well. So the desire not to lose is also there, which creates this threat detection from the brain. So at the end of the day, if you care about something, your brain's job is to create noise, right? It's like, pay attention to this, because that's how we've survived, right? Is there a snake there? Pay attention to that. Is there a cliff there? Pay attention to that, right? But the problem is that becomes difficult when you are trying to do something that you care about, which requires moving through adversity, but the brain's natural default is to avoid and remove difficult internal experiences.
And that's why I love this educational approach as well. We've had a chat earlier about just throwing tools at people, but that foundation of knowledge first and educating them is so freaking important. And can we just quickly go through as well? I understand there's 4 components to that framework. So we've got focus, reflection, imagery, and adaptability.
Yes.
And hopefully I can somehow there's a nice little diagram that you have. I can try and overlay that over some reels or something so that people can see the diagram. But can we maybe just run through what those 4 components are and how they sort of work together to...
Yeah. So essentially we sat down with the coaches and we're like, hey, can we choose a few key mental performance behaviors? And this is really key for the other programs. It's like we have to be clear on the behaviors that we want to see the athletes doing before we even look at like the skills, because the skills can be great, but what are they in service of? So that's really key, that the skills are in service of these 3 key behaviors, and that is wave selection, max ability on a wave, and key decision making, right? So arguably, if you're on the best waves and you maximize your ability on that wave and you make key decisions in strategic opportunities, then you're probably going to get through the heat. You're probably going to do pretty
solid
well.
argument.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, those are the 3 behaviors we want to see, right? And we've actually been measuring them over the last year. So now we've got data and graphs and wonderful stuff to show the athletes back of going, because I've got them to report to me after every heat how they did on those 3 behaviors, right? So that's how we're also capturing whether the skills that you just mentioned there are servicing those behaviors. So we then sat down and we went, all right, cool. We need ability to reflect. That's that first skill. It's like every athlete needs to be able to effectively reflect. What are we reflecting on? Those 3 behaviors. Great, cool. And then in surfing, that second skill is adaptability. You need a high level of adaptability. And what we've done is just added different levels in that, right? So how do you adapt to internal experiences, external experiences? You need to be wonderfully adaptable in a sport like surfing, where it's like the most dynamic, fluid, literally, sport out there, right? The third one's focus. We know that number 1 indicator of performance is focus. If you can focus on the right thing at the right time, it's probably the best indication of performance we have.
Well, that's flow state, in my opinion.
Yes.
When your focus is on the task and when it's primed, like that is when you're in flow state, right?
Yeah, and if I could like just say my job description in one sentence, it's like, what do you do? It's like, I try to get people to focus on the right thing at the right time.
Yep.
Whether they actually perform or not there's so many other constraints. But that's what we can work on. And then the 4th one then is imagery, which is we're looking at visualization and different things to bring either a sense of self to the context, which is really important, or how to practice certain turns, maneuvers, different things like that outside of the water.
That's amazing, mate. Look, there is so much to unpack there, but that is definitely for the next podcast, which will be released soon. That's an unreal summary of that whole, what would you call it, framework? It's a curriculum. We're going to do an online learning series for our athletes that are around the country, not just here at the HBC. Yeah, love that. Well, in the next episode, we'll dive into more of the actual each one of those individually to get some more sort of practical stuff. But what you've said there, mate, is so bloody valuable. So thank you very much for your insights on today's topic. If anyone has any further questions, they can hit up Tom on Instagram at TGS Performance Psychology.
That's the one.
That's the one.
Good mouthful.
Awesome. He's got some really good content up there. And if you're just genuinely curious about some of the cool shit you're doing with these surfers, you're posting stories. That last one last week with Bella, you were doing like Where's Wally?
Yeah, we keep it novel.
Yeah.
Do Where's Wally between waves. Do like a Scrabble word search thing. Just trying to, keep it novel.
Yeah, it's epic. So make sure you check out that Instagram page, and any other further questions, feel free to hit us up on Instagram at Flow Nutrition with an _. So thanks again for tuning in. We will catch you again next week. Tom, thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Flow Performance Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the chat and found loads of value that you can use to fuel your flow state. If you did enjoy the content and want to support the brand, make sure you jump on the website and grab some Flow nutritional bars. They are the most effective and convenient way to fuel your flow state. And as a valued podcast listener, you can get 10% off your total order with the code FLOWPOD at checkout. So thanks again for tuning in. We will catch you again next week.